There we go.
There we go. We have voices. Hello and welcome to the Model Car Podcast. I'm Justin.
And I'm John.
And this week, our first episode, we're going to be covering fit and finish and some other sections that we think will be interesting. I guess the first section that we want to talk about today is our section on fresh paint, which is news from the hobby. Been an interesting year for hobby building, right, John?
Yeah, sure has. Building is always fun, but with the recent changes with the model companies, the companies that make the models, well, that's complicating things on getting new kits.
Very much. So we're recording this in December 2018, if you're listening to this in the future. It's been an interesting year. Hobbyco went bankrupt, which really was Revell. That created all kinds of challenges. Everything that Revell had planned on issuing for the year came to a sudden stop and really seemed to affect the speed of which new kits were coming into the hobby. Revell for many years has probably been Revell and the Japanese companies are probably some of the best companies for releasing new kits. It seems that Revell has been purchased by a new company. And there's talk. I think we'll call it talk because this hobby, until we actually see it on the shelves, you can never count on it. But there's a brand new 1968 Chevelle kit coming out. Have you heard anything about that kit, John?
Aside from the fact that it's an all-new tool, no, not really.
I've seen a mock-up of the box art, but I haven't seen anything online yet of what the tooling looks like.
Couldn't tell you anything about what. Is it going to be a big block? Well, I assume so, but that's about all I can say at this time.
Yeah, that's about it for me as well. So that's going to be interesting. The other company that was doing really well over the last 4 or 5 years, I think, Mobius Models, was putting out some great kits, starting with the Hudson Hornet and working up to some of the pickup trucks over the last years. And they were sold to Pegasus Hobbies earlier this year. And that has also seemed to kill development. I think there's some modified tooling coming out, some kits based on existing things that they've done, modified a little bit. There's rumors, I think, again, about more kits that they're going to be releasing over the next perhaps year or so, but I haven't heard much more than that. Have you heard anything about what's going to happen with Mobius and Pegasus?
Well, I probably shouldn't talk too loudly because I know the product development manager, so I kind of have to bite my tongue if you get what I mean. Although, in theory, this will be old news by the time anybody hears it. But
and there you have the first official no comment on a podcast.
Well, yeah, semi-official, but I know there's currently rumors right now of the Model King and Mobius Models doing a Dodge Power Wagon, a 40s vintage Dodge Power Wagon, and officially, unofficially, the only thing I've heard right now is that as far as the person I know, not happening. So there would have to be a sizable investment from the Model King, a.k.a. Dave Burkett, before that would happen.
Okay. All right, the next section of our podcast is called Workbench. That's what we're working on now. John, I saw what you were working on in the show notes. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it? Sounds interesting.
Well, yeah, and I may have bitten off more than I can chew, but I've always considered myself more of a car modeler and somebody who's built more out of the box than anything else, as in using just what comes in the kit box with added details. But now I've decided, let's kill ourselves. And I've taken what is marketed as a toy. It's not really a toy because it's made by First Gear and they're known for doing very accurate scale replicas. It's a 2018 Mack Granite. They sell it Mack Granite truck. They sell it as a dump truck, but I've said, no, that's too easy just to make that an accurate replica. So I've decided that I wanted to scratch build a tow truck body for it. So yeah, and scratch building, for those that don't know the term, that means I'm building everything behind the cab out of sheet plastic.
Wow. So you're not taking one of the existing Peterbilt pickup truck type.
No, Peterbilt, no.
So this is literally a scratch built wrecker bed.
Yeah, the wrecker bed. The chassis will come from an Italeri kit, which is fine. It's a generic chassis. Good.
Wow.
Some argue, well, Mack doesn't do generic. Mack has done their own engineering. Yeah, not anymore. They don't do their own. They don't offer their own Camelback suspensions anymore. So I can get away with a kit offering.
Wow, that's quite an ambitious undertaking. How long do you figure that's going to take you to get?
Well, I'm hoping that I will have it done for my local show in mid or late March. So,
wow.
Or at least something to look at the show. I don't guarantee it'll be finished, but
are you working on any? Are you going to work on any other kits at the same time, or are you just going to focus on the one big project?
Well, I'm just going to try to mostly focus on the one big project. I do have to. From Maine, we've done a kit exchange. He's going to build a model truck for a show in Massachusetts next October, and I will build a motorcycle like what he builds for that show. So that could be interesting. I've never built a motorcycle before, so
I have to ask, because I'm a motorcycle guy myself. What kind of bike are you going to build?
It's the Tamiya Yamaha YZR 500 racing bike.
Okay.
YZR 500. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I got it right.
I'm impressed. Yeah, that's those Tamiya kits can be a little challenging sometimes, particularly with the masking and all the rest of those. But
well, it's one color body. He included some aftermarket decals with it, and I was basically in the choice. Well, I can do it red, like what comes in the kit, or I can do it blue and have a Red Bull bike. So I said, yeah, Red Bull.
Very cool. That'll be fun to see as well. I'm quite looking forward to this truck, seeing how that goes. How far are you into the process so far?
Yeah, I've been working at it for about a week and a half now, and I still haven't put any glue to any of the parts that I've made. So you tell me.
And this is off a toy.
A cab. There will be no interior to the cab, but I can live with that.
So you've got the toy, you've stripped it all down, and you're
yes, and I'm taking away all the changes that they made to it, because it was originally made for a chain of gas stations in the United States, and they do this for every Christmas now. They came out with a new truck last year. It was an International. This year it's a Mack, and it had working sound and working lights, and I said, no, that's not going to work for my idea. So all the holes for the working lights and etc. have all been filled. The buttons to turn on the working lights have all been filled.
I just have flashbacks to sort of the 1970s Japanese kits that used to have no back seat because they had, the place for all the batteries underneath with the little, I never liked those either. I spent so many hours fixing those holes and defects. So I can imagine what you're up against.
That's not hard.
Have you got a color scheme in mind?
No, I don't. Well, aside from the fact that, of course, I'm known for running, if you will, the Can-Am Garage, which is basically just a background to take pictures of models in, but it's always ended up being a little bit more than that. I was going to have the company logo on the doors, but a friend has said, no, I got just what you need to put on the cab doors. Okay, but he's offering no hints, so we shall see.
It sounds like you're a little bit away from painting anything, so I'm sure that you've got some time to figure out the color scheme.
Yes and no on the painting part. So I'm trying to take what he tells me to do as gospel, and he's saying build the truck, then worry about the rest. So if I build the truck, it means I got to paint the cab, and I'll have to know what color it's going to be to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll get there.
I think that's going to be surprising to all of us.
Yeah. Me too, if I actually make it happen.
Excellent. That's a really cool project. Look forward to hearing more about it as we go. I'm just my project is I don't know how you kind of say it. It's an on again off again project that keeps working its way back onto my building desk, and I kind of do a little bit on it, and then it goes away again. It's a Larry Ferrari 250 California, and I think the biggest problem for me, I tend to be nowhere near as ambitious as you. I like to build box stock. If I raid a kit for parts for another kit, I feel really guilty about taking away the value of that kit. It's one of those weird things. So I have a ton of aftermarket things for kits that I prefer to use. And scratch building, well, I'm just not that talented. So the 250 California, I bought a resin kit to correct the interior. The interior on it is out of the kit is not correct for that car. And I keep looking at it and trying to get it to fit, and I just haven't got there with it. And every time the body's done, it's foiled, it's, everything is great. It's a black finish. But every time I get back towards the interior, it just kind of, I'll do a couple of things and then it ends up back in the box again. So that's kind of my ambitious project. I've got the replicas and miniatures V12 engine for it as well, which is an absolutely gorgeous engine, but again, far too ambitious. So I keep looking at it and saying, yes, this is the one I need to finish. And then I keep looking at the other abandoned projects and wondering, maybe I could just get some momentum and get one of these done. But I'm not sure which way I'm going to go. I've not had as much building time as I would like over the last month or so. So hopefully I'll get some time to go back to that. But I feel really insignificant compared to scratch building a tow truck.
Yeah. First time I've tried building a tow truck, one could point their fingers and say, well, it's all because of Highway Through Hell on Discovery Canada, but no, it's not really that, although that doesn't help. I've been interested in heavy tow trucks since, I guess about 25 years now. And the fact that one of the manufacturers is less than an hour away from me, although you don't see very many of them on Highway Through Hell, they're NRC, which is made in St. Alphonse de Granby. And
cool. Have you been over to visit that plant?
Yes, actually, I have walked the plant with a friend, and boy, they build high quality stuff, and those trucks are just massive.
I can imagine. All right, so I think that leads us on to our theme, the theme of the day. For our first episode, we wanted to talk about fit and finish. So a lot of modelers, at least that I've talked to, John, and I'm sure that you're probably the same way, focus very much on the paint job as the be-all and end-all of model car building. If you can get a great paint job, then you've built a great model. And
I disagree, but
there's a lot of focus on it. You pick up any model car magazine, and you're probably going to have painting discussions and polishing discussions and all the rest of that. But I think what can let down a lot of models, even if the paint is flawless, is basic fit and finish. Fit and finish is really the basics of model car building. How do you get a scale model to sit on the bench and look like a scale replica of what you're wanting to do? And so we figured we'd touch on some of the common problems that we've seen and give some ideas on how we deal with them and what we recommend for other people to try. Now, model car building is not an exact science. If you talk to 50 different modelers, there are 50 different ways to do everything. So we're not saying that ours is the only way to do it, but it's one way to do it. So just to get that disclaimer out there.
Ways to do it? You got two modelers, so.
Yeah, and I just from some of our offline conversations, I know that we do use tools and products differently. So I think it's going to be a fun conversation, just even the differences between ourselves. The first one of our common problems, though, is seams. I don't think there's anything that stands out under a really good paint job as a missed seam.
Yeah, paint, it just makes the mistakes more visible.
Yeah. So the seams are, when the tooling, high pressure metal tooling that the plastic is injected into come together, there's usually a little line that needs cleaning up. And that's what we're talking about with seams. Usually in a model car, these tend to be over the fenders, the front and back, and usually up and over the roof line. But they can be in all kinds of other interesting and weird places depending on the model kit itself.
On the design of the car, the design of the model kit, whoever decided, well, we're going to put it here. Sometimes the kit manufacturers put them in locations that's easy for us to remove. Other times you look at it and say, what were they thinking?
Yeah. Nothing worse than having to obliterate half of the detail on a kit because they put a seam right in the middle of it.
Yeah. Or to lose a badge just because you want to clean up a mold line. So
what's your process for cleaning up a seam or mold line?
Well, depending on how bad it is, I generally just prefer to sand it. But if it's really bad, sometimes you need to use a files. And if it's even worse, you may need to use putty sandpaper. And yeah, no. It also depends how close something may or may not be. Something you don't want to damage may or may be to it.
Exactly.
There's, as you said, you can ask 50 modelers, you get 50 different answers, but you still want to do something about them.
Yeah. For the common, regularly, I don't think I've seen too many that you have to get the putty out for. There are occasional ones, but normally for me,
the more likely that is to happen.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. The way I usually approach it is I use the FlexiFile sanding sticks.
Oh yes, love the FlexiFile themselves and the FlexiFile sanding sticks.
Yeah, both of those. Usually, that's where I'll start. I find that I have a lot of control over those. Depending on, I usually run my fingernail across to see how big those are. I look in all the usual spots, and then we'll just kind of lightly sand that. Usually, I like to do a fine if it's not too bad. I'll go to medium if there is a lot of texture. I try not to go much coarser than that, because otherwise you end up with so much work trying to bring it down to a flush finish again, so that you don't have to fill it or
also be careful not to ruin the original body contour too.
Exactly. Do you ever, one of the things I do sometimes is, if it's near a trim line or something like that, is I'll actually put down a little strip of Tamiya tape over the part that I don't want to sand. Do you have any tips for what you do differently?
I do the same thing as you, except I don't generally, being that Tamiya tape is kind of expensive, I just tend to use regular old masking tape when I'm trying to protect something.
I may or may not have sanded through masking tape.
Yeah, I have too, but it's also I guess maybe I'm weird. I can feel the difference when I hit the masking tape. It's like, oh, back off.
Yeah, it's always harder to create something than it is to sand it off. So again, but I think one of your points that you brought up was really good. Be careful of ruining your contours, particularly on rounded fenders. I've seen a lot of kits out there that
have rounded fenders.
They have rounded fenders with a flat spot on the top, and that's really challenging for that. One of the techniques for identifying seams is the block sanding, or with using contrasting colors. Do you ever do that?
No, I've never gone so far as to use a guide coat. Maybe I'm still I'm at 50 now. Maybe my eyes are still good. I can get away without doing that. Maybe in a few years I'll have to change how I do it. Maybe shoot on a coat of primer before I do any sanding. But so far, no, haven't had to do that.
Oh, you're lucky. I've done it a couple of times. Usually when I've done it, it's been not necessarily for seams, but if I've done a lot of body work, I really want to see what I've not done a good job on. And so that's the only time I generally use one. I think at this point in my model building experience, I've got a really good idea of where those seams are. It's very rare that one will catch me off guard of, I didn't expect that one. You kind of know where to look over the fenders, over the roof line, the front and back, over the trunk, and so forth. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that if a modeler, a new modeler, is trying that and really has problems identifying the seams, what you can do is spray a guide coat, a mist coat of a dark primer or a flat black or something like that, and just sand it off down to the bare plastic. What will happen is the areas that have problems will sand off, that have high spots will sand off first. The areas that we're going to talk about a little bit later, the sink holes and things like that, you'll be able to identify those because they won't actually sand off at all, and you'll have dark spots in your model kit. It takes quite a bit more work. It's going to add, probably a couple of days worth of extra priming, dry time, sanding time, cleaning time. But if you have a kit, particularly if you've got an older kit or a kit that's been re-released a lot of times, you may want to consider doing that.
Sounds good.
One of the other problems that I've quite often seen is glue marks. Nothing can ruin a fantastic model as a fingerprint on glass or on the nice finished paint itself. Any thoughts on how you can avoid those types of errors, John?
Well, first you keep your fingers out of the glue, but but that's too obvious, isn't it?
Definitely. I don't think I've put any intentional ones on so far, but I have maybe done some unintentional ones.
I was just knowing what we were going to talk about. I was thinking about it. I don't want to come off sounding perfect, but I don't think I've ever done it. And I guess the advantage is when I'm working with clear parts, I will tend to use the Tester's clear part cement, and that is water soluble. So you just clean off the excess with water.
I tend to be a little bit more hardcore. I'm one of those builders that gets everything together ahead of time, gets it all painted, and then sits in a mad panic trying to fit everything together with no patience. So I am one of those guys that loves that gap-filling super glue like you wouldn't believe. And of course, as you know, super glue has some interesting challenges. So as John was saying,
that will let you do a lot more than just put a fingerprint on the model.
Exactly. And I think, a lot of modelers use different glues, and I think we're going to talk about glues in a separate episode. But one of the things to remember, as John said, is different glues behave in different ways. So using the right glue at the right time is going to really help that out. I think one of the big places that I see glue marks is on glass. And as you know, the Testers is great. It's a water cleanup. I tend to use a 2-part epoxy, which also works really well. The 2-part epoxy, I choose to use a 5-minute one. I find I'm not sitting there for too long waiting for things to set up. I can usually clamp them without moving them for a whole 5 minutes. With the advantage of the 2-part epoxy is that it will, if you take the end of a sharp toothpick, you can actually clean it off. So that's one of the ways to do that. I think a lot of people tend to use, at least beginning mistakes, you tend to use tube glue or a super glue or, other glues that may not be quite appropriate to things like that. The other thing is also to be careful of where you're putting your glues on there. Mistakes happen. If you've got a glue that starts to set up and dry, it may go stringy. And I've actually done this myself and ruined a perfectly good kit at the end of the process by having a little line of glue right across the finished paint job. And of course, there was nothing I could do to fix that apart from back to the strip tank. So, there's just be cautious about the glues, consider what they're going to do. And then, listen in a few episodes, we're going to have a bigger discussion as far as the different glues that we use and the advantages and disadvantages of them. The next thing that I've seen that John, we talked about, hasn't seen as much of is bad fitting glass. I think this comes a lot in a couple of areas. One is kit design. Some of the vintage kits had more challenges with glass. And the other area is in paint buildup and bare metal foil buildup, again, on perhaps some of the domestic and vintage kits particularly. Everything comes down to test fitting. And I think that's one of the problems that we can get into is we just want to build and we don't want to take that prep time. So, there's nothing worse than having your finished painted kit. You've got all your bare metal foil and you're trying to fit a piece of glass into it. And now because of the extra paint and the extra foil, you don't have enough clearance and you're forcing something and either the glass breaks or you end up with glass that doesn't quite fit. And if it doesn't quite fit in one spot, perhaps that holds the whole glass infrastructure away from the roof and you don't get that part. One of the things that I've had to do in cases like that is usually, particularly on North American kits, the glass comes in one piece. It's got the front with a runner to the back. So you've got both of your glass in there, and usually the rear side windows are all molded together. If you have problems with glass fitting, cut the panels apart so that you're fitting each one separately. It's going to take a little bit more gluing, a little bit more care and attention, but I think sometimes the results of those can be much more superior to where you're trying to force fit glass that doesn't quite fit as well into a body. Any thoughts on bad fitting glass, John?
No, because I don't. Again, as we discussed earlier, I don't recall ever really experiencing such a problem. Again, I don't want to come off as sounding as if I don't have any problems, sure, but I normally make my own problems by trying scratch building or things like that, as opposed to just having problems with kit parts. I guess it's because, as you said, test fit, and adjust the fit before you get to paint and foil and etc.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that goes on to our next part. Ill-fitting hoods, trunks, doors, those kind of things. One of the biggest problems of a lot of kits that I see is that everything fits nicely until you put paint on there. A nice coat of paint, polished, and all the rest of that does add significant dimensions to a hood. And if you've not allowed for that in your test fitting, you can have a problem where your hood no longer fits, or even worse, it fits and it chips the finished paint the first time that you actually try to use that. So, that I think that just comes back to one of our kind of ongoing themes is just test fit everything. Make sure that you've got as much as you can clearance, that you've test fit it as mocked up as you can. You want to almost have the kit fully assembled before you start painting anything, because once you paint it, you're kind of running into those problems. For me, I tend to prime things so that I have an idea of what that's going to be before I do a lot of the test fitting. How about you, John? What's your approach to test fitting?
Test fit, and test fit again. I generally do test fit everything. I also, part of me, I guess, is I also assume that major body parts are going to fit decently, courtesy of the engineering behind the kits, but that is more of a thing of the last 20 or 30 years than, say, of 50 years ago. A kit that was engineered 50 years ago. Good God. Okay. Just thinking the time frame involved. I know they were doing the best they could at the time, but in comparison with today's engineering, it doesn't compare. So you have to remember that. You have to take that into your thought process before working on it.
Raised wheels, common problem that I've seen. That could come from a couple different things. A warped chassis is usually the most common problem for that. But sometimes, even just the fit when everything fits together.
Well, it goes back to what you said about bad fitting glass. If your glass fits improperly, that can affect the interior, and the interior can affect the chassis, can affect a wheel or wheels being offset so that they're raised, and thus the car will wobble when you put your hand on it. And You don't want that.
Have you?
Well, that's more challenging, but
have you ever had to deal with that? And have you got any tips or cheats for ways to deal with that at the last minute?
At the last minute, well, no, because it normally, it goes back, like I said, about test fitting. If you test fit it at the beginning, well, you generally don't have problems at the beginning. It's at the end, I should say. It's like the old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Yeah, I've had that problem personally. I've ended up, one of the little cheats that I've had to do is trim. The back of a wheel usually has the little nubbin on it that the axle goes into. Mm-hmm. I've ended up cutting that off one wheel, moving it up just fractionally so that wheel fits on the ground, gluing it back into position, and making sure that wheel doesn't rotate anymore.
Yeah, that's for sure. It's not going to rotate now.
It's a little bit of a hack, but I had a kit that had a warped chassis plate, and I straightened it. I had this elaborate rubber band. It would have looked like something that you saw in a collision shop, with all these opposing forces to try to straighten it out. No matter what I did, I couldn't get it quite square. And I wanted to build the kit, so I just went ahead anyway. And that was kind of one of those little things that you can do. There are ways to fix some of those things. Obviously, if you're too far out with those, you're going to run into clearance gaps between the wheel and the body. But, for a small little adjustment, you can do things that can make a difference like that.
Yep.
Speaking of chassis that don't fit, or chassis that you have to bend 3 inches out so that you can clear everything.
Yeah, that's not so much a problem for me. I was just thinking of some of the late 60s Corvettes where they have such a tight opening for the chassis to get it in to squeeze the chassis into the lower body, but in which case an awful lot of prayer and please work.
There's nothing worse than hearing that cracking sound of a glue seam as you're stretching a body to put it over a chassis. Yeah. One tip that I've got in regards to that is I usually find that the chassis, the biggest challenge for those is actually the wheel wells. And so once or twice on some challenging kits, I've actually trimmed the outside of the wheel well. It's not really noticeable from when the car is fully assembled, but it's certainly one of those things that can help how much you have to stretch that chassis to get it in there. Now, I have to ask, John, are you somebody that puts the interior in first, or do you mount the chassis or the interior to the chassis and put the combined unit in?
I do however the instructions say, believe it or not.
You read the instructions.
I read instructions. I prefer to mount it to the body if it can, but sometimes there's no positive locator for it, so then you have to mount it to the chassis.
Huh. So a couple of lessons that I've got from John already. One is test fit, and 2 is read the instructions. Ha.
Yeah, well, most guys don't like to read instructions or ask for directions, but hey, maybe I'm more in touch with my feminine side. Who knows?
Engines that sit too high. I wouldn't say a common problem, but I've seen it enough.
Yeah, I've seen it, and sometimes you can figure out easy ways to solve it. Other times, well, how did that happen? Don't know. Well,
yeah, that's always. Have you ever had to resort to leaving the carburetor off so that the air filter fits low enough, or is that just something I've done as a hack?
I've sanded down the top of a carburetor, but not left it off. No, that wouldn't work right. But then again, I guess sanding off the top of a carburetor doesn't work well either. But minor detail.
Yeah,
nobody notices. And if you're building it for yourself as opposed to building it for a competition.
This is where superglue comes in really handy, because once you superglue the air filter on, nobody's going to notice anyway. Little tip.
Very true.
High rider suspensions is quite often in model cars. I see challenges, even in modern kits, between how the finished car sits and what the one-to-one scale car looks like. Have you ever seen any of those? And do you have any tips for how to deal with those?
I built a replica of my own car, which is a 2016 Ford Mustang. And I'm sitting here looking at the picture of it, and I still say the front end of the model just doesn't look right. It sits too high, yet the spacing for the wheel and in the wheel well opening is fine, but it just doesn't look right. At least not to me in comparison to what my car looks like. So I don't know what I did wrong. I don't know if I did anything wrong, but it just doesn't look right.
Yeah, those are really hard things to fix. Again, my little hack that I've done before is either cutting off the attachment point for the suspension that goes into the wheel, moving that up or down as needed. Sometimes, depending on how the kit is, I've trimmed some of the suspension components just to fit a little bit better, or I've even added shims, short shims, to increase that. There's a pickup truck that I did that I had to put little shims in because otherwise it drove like a car. So I think it comes down to test fitting, what they can do. But I think it's something that is important to look for. And again, that's one of those that I think if you're doing your test fitting correctly, it's an area you will identify ahead of time, and you can look at things. Even though the kit may go together well, it's not an error. It's just part of that stance. What does that stance look like? And those could be really challenging things to do. Test fit, adjust on the go, but keep in mind that can detract from the final vehicle look. I think one of those ideas, though, John, is you could also go up and raise your suspension on your one-to-one to make it match.
No, don't think so. That'd be a lot more costly.
How about Spur Marks? What have you seen, and how do you avoid those?
Spur Marks, as in where the parts come off the trees?
You bet. That's always an interesting and challenging one.
Never twist the parts off the trees or your sprues. Never. It never works out. That's the first thing. If you do, well, then there's always sanding and putty. But that's the only solutions to the problem that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I think for me, I have slightly different techniques depending on what it is. If it's an unpainted plastic part that's going to be, engine parts, seat parts, those types of things, I just use flat-sided clippers. I have some old X-Acto, or not X-Acto, classic Model Master ones from the days when Tester made a really good line that I love, and they just do a really flat cut. One thing that I have to be very careful of is on parts that have a curve to them. You don't want to cut them too tight. So in some of those, what I end up doing is cutting a little further out and then either sanding or using an X-Acto knife to trim down to the level of the vehicle itself, or the part itself. One of the areas that I wanted to bring up is plastic, or the clear plastic areas. I've seen and have had too many problems where if you clip it flush with a windshield, for example, you can actually end up with radial fractures in the glass. The clear glass material is much harder and easier to shatter than the regular colored plastic, just for the clarity of it. And so what I tend to do is I'll cut, 1/8 of an inch out on the sprue, and then I'll take, back to the trusty flexophiles and head back and just sand that down. And I tend to find that works so much better and has added, taken away so much frustration that I used to have for sprue marks and cracks within there.
Yep.
The other one is damaged chrome. That's one of the areas that we get into with that as well. I find chrome to be one of those, chrome bumpers particularly, to be one of those areas that's very difficult to remove properly and to touch up well. I think the same thing, cut a little bit further off, sand down. But how do you touch up damaged chrome? What's your best method for that, John?
Well, have you tried the Molotov chrome pens?
I have. I picked those up last year when they first came out, and those are absolutely amazing.
That's what I do.
Before that, I used to use, well, depending on what it was, Sharpie or little pieces of chrome foil. The chrome foil, though, I found always showed. You'd always have a line somewhere.
I could never get what I considered acceptable results with chrome foil. So when the Molotov pens came out, just got a whole lot easier.
And the other thing with that Molotov paint is it also, once it dries, can be removed with a sharpened toothpick as well. Works really well for that. So, be careful. The other thing that can be done for damaged chrome that I've done before, which is a whole lot more work, but depending on the level of damage, is to strip it completely and use Alclad, or send it out for rechroming.
I've tried Alclad. That doesn't really. No, it's not. It works, but it's not quite chrome enough. If that makes sense.
Yeah, what I've done when I've had to do that is I've stripped all the chrome so that everything on the car has the same finish. If you try to do just a few pieces, it really shows. If you do all of the chrome on a vehicle and Alclad, which is, again, this comes down to a whole lot more work, then I think you can get an acceptable look. It's not chrome, but it's close enough that if you don't have anything right next to it that screams, this is kit chrome, I think it can be passable. But there's certainly options out there. Have you ever sent your stuff out for rechroming?
20 years ago, no, more like 25 or 30 years ago, I did do that when there was a chrome company here in Quebec. It was known as Chrome Plus or Louis Bernier, and quality work. Mm-hmm. And I haven't done it since. And following some threads online about that, people are, well, maybe yes, maybe no, and well, we wish Louis was back. Yeah, you're right, but that's about all I've heard.
Yeah, I think there is I'm not sure who it is. I can't remember who it is off the top of my head, but there's a company down in the States that does do that.
Well, there's 2 or 3. There's Chrome Plus. No, not Chrome Plus. Little Motor Car in Pennsylvania does it. And I think he gets better results than basically a subcontractor. He takes your parts and sends it to a chrome plater, and yeah, okay. But what happens? What happens if you lose my parts as opposed to the chrome plater? Or if the chrome plater loses my parts, as opposed to doing it the way Louis did it, where Louis did the chrome plating
right then and there.
Yeah.
I've never tried doing that. It's kind of been on my list of things to do, but I tend to build more modern kits, not as many vintage kits where I have to worry about the quality of the chrome. So that's kind of I think a small thing in my favor. The final thing we want to talk about as far as this section, fit and finish, is panel lines. And John, how do you treat your panel lines on your models?
Well, if it's supposed to be a moving panel, like for example a trunk lid or a door, because most kits the doors and trunk lids aren't opened for us by the kit manufacturer, I will put a wash in the panel lines to give it some definition. Other people, I've been picked on for doing that. Hey, go look at your full-size car. You can easily see where the doors open or the trunk lid opens or the hood opens, as opposed to panels that are just there.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I agree, and I think one of the, that comes down to personal preference, and certainly we're not here to say how it should be done, but I think both John and I agree that the panel lines tend to make a model pop more as a replica of the one-to-one. One of the challenges that I sometimes see is that panel lines on some kits are inconsistent or not deep enough. And this, again, comes down to fit and finish, but it's an easy thing to miss, particularly because you're not going to notice this until you've got your final clear coats on, is how deep that is and how well it's going to accept a wash. So sometimes, I've noticed it particularly around doors. One half of the door looks fantastic with a nice, just the right fidelity wash in it. The other side, well, it doesn't actually fill properly because I've left the panel line too thin. So there's a couple of ways that I've done to scribe panel lines. Quite often what I'll do is I'll just take the back of a number 11 blade and just run it down each panel line that I'm going to fill before I even start painting, before I even start priming anything. The other one that I've used is bare metal foil has a scribing tool. Mm-hmm. The one challenge is you've got to be so light with both of those tools. Otherwise, you'll end up having to fill scratch lines if you go a little too heavy. And that could be, it can be very time consuming. One of the things I've done in the past where I've had really, really challenging panel lines is to actually make a template out of a piece of index card and take that on just to help the guide coat or the guiding of the blade. That way you're not going to accidentally push too hard and end up with a scratch that goes across the middle of a door panel, for example. I've done that, and certainly that becomes a huge challenge because now you're having to fill that.
Mistake.
Yeah, you've just created a whole bunch more work for yourself. And usually when you're filling a scratch mark that's right by a panel line, you end up filling in the panel line and having to start from scratch all over again. So if you could avoid that, I really think that's a key thing. I got to ask, John, what do you use for a wash? Do you have a favorite product that you use?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, was it? I discovered that Tamiya had issued a series of washes. I think there's 3 different colors, and I only grabbed one at the time, and I should have grabbed the others, but it's their black panel line accent wash or accent panel line, what they're calling it. But yeah, that's the stuff. Love it. It's essentially just an enamel wash, but it works.
Yeah, I've got to say I've used that before, and that's the one that comes in a little bottle that looks a little bit like their
the same box as their glue.
Exactly, that was it. It's funny. I've used that. I still tend to go back to my old trusted favorite, which is usually I paint generally in lacquers, so I will use an acrylic Tamiya. I'll put a semi-gloss black in with a little
thinning acrylics. Never.
I do that. I put some thinner in it, and what I tend to do is put just a drop of soap in it, and the soap allows it breaks the surface tension of the paint, and I just find that allows it to flow. Without that, it just becomes a real challenge. But with that little detail, it's really great. And then I tend to go, I like Tamiya acrylics. Usually what I'll do is I'll put it on fairly heavy, and it's going to come out of the panel lines, and I can quickly take some polishing compound and just quickly wipe over the areas that are outside of the panels. And that's just kind of it may not be the quickest. I know Tamiya's got some great stuff. There are other products out there on the market as well that do that. I think Detail Master has another wash that comes in various colors, but that's kind of my preference, a little different than John's there. Lots of ways to build a model car kit, and I'm sure that's just one of the places that we maybe differ a little bit. All right, so that's kind of the end of our section on fit and finish. If you have any ideas or questions that you would like us to tackle, or at least hear our somewhat long-winded opinions on, please drop us a line. We've got a Q&A section that we'd love to hear from you. what questions would you like us to deal with specifically? Particularly if you got any fit and finish questions. If you hear the podcast and you have any thoughts, what you'd like to add to the conversation. There's lots of ways to do that. If you've got some great best practices, send them into us. We'll bring them up on the podcast as well. We'll do a little bit of follow-up from previous episodes. So thank you very much. For our closing shout-outs, John and I met online, I don't know how many years ago. We've kind of been internet pen pals, I guess might be the way to say that, for many years. And I'd like to shout out to Tom Carter at Spotlight Hobbies. He's if you've not been over to the model message board at Spotlight Hobbies, I highly recommend it. It's got a great model car club feeling. There's some great people over there, some highly talented modelers that share their work. And I just wanted to thank out to Tom.
There's the various guys who've written for Skell Auto over the years that are generally show up on Spotlight too. So
yeah,
Tim Wade and Terry Jesse, and among others.
Yeah, it's just a hugely talented group there, and it's a great community. There's other communities out there. The model car magazines tend to run their own boards. This is just the one, perhaps because I've been doing it for so long. But it's somewhere that I'm online pretty much every day, and I think John's the same way on that one. So, Mr. Tom Carter, thank you so much for facilitating that and giving us the introduction that really became the idea behind the podcast. With that, I'd like to say thanks very much. You can reach us. You can see our show notes at modelcar.show is our website, modelcar.show. We'll have our show notes up there. You can follow us online. You can send us an email. We're at modelcarpodcast@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at Model Car Podcast, at Twitter, Model Car Podcast, and Instagram, Model Car Podcast. Easy to remember. Please feel free to reach out to us, give us your tips, some feedback, what you liked, what we could improve on. It'd also be a great help if you're listening to this on a podcast player. Give us a thumbs up. If you're on Apple, go to Apple, subscribe to us, and give us a review telling us that you like us. 5-star reviews are going to help us get out there and help us be found by other modelers. Also, if you have other model car hobbyists that you're friends with, please let them know about what we're doing. We'd love to build up a community of listeners and work with, providing hopefully quality discussion to you every 2 weeks. John, where can people find you online?
Well, aside, of course, from Spotlight, being online at Spotlight Hobbies, I'm also on Facebook as John K. Dezan.
Excellent. And you can find me online. I'm usually under one of my other projects, which is Right Experience, Twitter, Instagram, so forth. And, feel free to reach out to us. John, any closing thoughts on this first episode that went a lot longer than we had anticipated?
No, I can't say I have any problems right now. We'll see what happens.
Excellent. Well, thanks everybody for listening. We plan to be back in 2 weeks with our next episode and our next topic. Until then, say goodbye, John.
Goodbye, John. Goodbye, John. Goodbye, John. Goodbye, John. Goodbye, John. Goodbye, John.